Good afternoon. I'm Jason Marzak, Director of the Adrian Arce Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of our second report on the Maduro regime's illicit activities, especially at this critical moment for Venezuela. This virtual collaboration is between the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arce Latin America Center, as well as the Middle East Security Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. I'd like to start off by giving a special welcome to Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is joining us live today. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us. As well as a thank you to Congressman Michael Waltz for his participation in today's program. I'd also like to acknowledge businesswoman and philanthropist Adrian Arce, who is, of course, the founder of the Adrian Arce Latin America Center, the founder of the Adrian Arce Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, and also the executive vice chair at the Atlantic Council. Adrian, thank you so much for joining us and for your strategic vision as always. I will set the stage first. Venezuela, as many of you know who are watching, is entering a new phase in its political and humanitarian crisis. As the country heads into sham parliamentary elections in December, amid increasing political repression, the Maduro regime continues to be entrenched. Sanctions have had limited impact on the regime's grip on power, with Maduro continuing to be propped up by a global network of nefarious actors and illicit activities. This is why we continue to drill down on raising further awareness on how the United States and its partners around the world can continue to try to counter the illicit flows that are going to the regime. Over the years, there's been much discussion about Iran in Latin America, with the policy debate ranging from sometimes misguided alarm-raising arguments of Iran's role in the region to putting aside the risks totally of Iran's influence, especially in Venezuela. Today's event is about putting into perspective the role and influence of Iran and Hezbollah in particular in Venezuela. The Adrian Arce Latin America Center report by Joseph Humry being launched today, and the conversation with our speakers seeks to provide nuanced understanding on the Maduro regime's ties to Iran and Iran-backed Hezbollah networks supporting the regime, as well as potential strategies to curtail these illicit networks and help secure democratic restoration in Venezuela. I'd like to reiterate the Atlantic Council's commitment to helping to bring international attention and action to achieving democratic stability in Venezuela. Today's report and conversation are part of the Adrian Arce Latin America Center's ongoing body of work around Venezuela, seeking a peaceful political resolution to the Venezuela crisis that guarantees sustainable democratic stability and reconstruction through work with Venezuela's democratic forces, as well as through greater alignment in the international community. A reminder that this discussion is being streamed across the Atlantic Council's various social media platforms. You can also join the conversation online via Twitter using the hashtag #ACVenezuela. I'd like to now turn to a congressional conversation before we transition to a more focused report discussion with the panel, and begin by welcoming Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Congressman Wasserman Schultz, thank you so much for joining us today for this important discussion. We'll kick off the conversation with you, and then we'll bring in my earlier conversation today with Congressman Waltz. As our guests know, Congressman Debbie Wasserman Schultz represents Florida's 23rd Congressional District and the greater Miami area, covering parts of Broward County and Miami-Dade County, which includes, of course, large segments of the Venezuela population. She's been representing Florida in the House since 2005 and serves as a cardinal on the Appropriations Committee, making history as the first ever woman to chair the Military Construction and Veteran Affairs Subcommittee. And she is, of course, also the Democratic co-chair of the Venezuela Democracy Caucus. Again, welcome, Congressman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason.
My first question to you, Congresswoman, with sham parliamentary elections that I was just mentioning in Venezuela in December, the future of a political resolution to the Venezuela crisis is frankly, unfortunately, as uncertain as ever. Regardless of the outcome, state and non-state actors and the illicit activities that sustain them are going to continue supporting the regime and doing everything possible to destabilize the country and destabilize democratic forces. I'd like to start with your opinion on what more should the United States and the broader international community be doing to deepen support for democratic forces in Venezuela, especially taking into account the spoiler influence of external actors?
Well, first of all, thank you to the Atlantic Council for having an ongoing series of discussions about the crisis in Venezuela, and my love, affection, and respect continues to go out to Adrian Arsht, who is a dear friend and an incredible benefactor, and really someone who has international vision. Um, the really key answer to your question is that international cooperation is absolutely essential to make sure that we are continuing a unified approach to trying to make sure that we can pressure the Maduro regime to eventually leave peacefully. I mean, the sham, elections that are being held in December, uh, you know, are I put elections in quotes because you can't have something called an election when you're blocking opposition parties from even participating. And I mean, for example, the European Union is not sending observers to monitor Venezuela's election because they, you know, cite a lack of fair conditions for a vote, and that's a decision that I support. They just need to sort of be ignored, discarded, and the 57 countries that recognize the Guaido administration need to continue to apply pressure. Uh, Clearly, the Venezuelan people need to be able to choose their own future through free, fair, transparent, multi-party elections, and quite frankly, part of the key to this is that the United States can't do this alone. We need to make sure that the OAS, the Lima Group, and other regional actors are fully engaged in really helping to apply that pressure. But what the U.S. has done through the appropriations process is that we've funded critical programs that help address the economic, humanitarian, and political crisis in Venezuela. And making sure that those funds actually get to the Venezuelan people is critical. So the humanitarian assistance that we've provided is essential. Non-humanitarian assistance, funding democracy and human rights assistance, development assistance, global health aid, those are all critical components to making sure that a transition can happen.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, and thank you so much also for bringing up the importance of humanitarian assistance. As we're having this conversation today about illicit activities and nefarious actors, and it's so important to always be grounding this conversation and frankly the Venezuelan people and the U.S. partnership and the role of the international community more broadly. Uh, as co-chair of the Venezuela Democracy Caucus, you've been very vocal as well on the need for countering the threat that Russia, China, Cuba, and now increasingly Iran pose in Venezuela. Last year, you sponsored the Russia-Venezuelan Threat Mitigation Act, which successfully passed in the House, was included in the Verdad Act, which ultimately passed as part of the year-end spending bill. I'd like to ask, now here we are in October, what impact has your Russia-Venezuela legislation had thus far this year? And then also, should additional legislation be contemplated to help mitigate the threat of other foreign actors, such as Iran in Venezuela?
Well, I'm thankful that through the Verdad Act, the Russian Venezuela Threat Mitigation Act became law. It required the State Department to assess the threat posed by Russian Venezuelan security cooperation and the impact that it has on the United States, as well as our allies in the region, because we really need a strategy in actively combating the Kremlin's influence. Things like the essential need for the administration to closely monitor foreign acquisition of assets owned by Citgo, for example, which, as you know, is the state-owned oil company, and functions as Citgo in the U.S. The bill would impose visa bans on foreigners who are or who have been active in supporting the Russian government directly or indirectly and their Venezuelan security forces. And it would revoke the visas for such individuals who are already present in the country. And although that's mandated by the legislation, we received a report from the State Department, and it lays out the Russian influence in Venezuela, but the strategy to combat the cooperation really seems to be lacking. And I want to work with the administration more on the visa ban aspect of my legislation, because I'm not sure whether they're utilizing it. That isn't clear in the threat assessment report that they sent to Congress, and it could be a powerful tool. They did lay out four key components of the U.S. strategy, and that included promoting democracy, applying economic and diplomatic pressure on the regime, combating disinformation with reliable communications, and providing, as you mentioned, much needed development and humanitarian aid. But, you know, that's all well and good, but unless there's some pain felt by the actors that are propping up Maduro, then through their you know shrunken ability to move and to travel, then I'm not sure that the strategy is going to be terribly effective. So, making all of the Russia's efforts continue unabated, really, in Venezuela, and that's the sad reality. Another thing that's important that we can do is we have to ensure that OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, has the funding needed to enforce the economic and trade sanctions. And we passed an increase in that funding in the House bill last year. That's critical that we make sure that goes forward. And Maduro and his cronies that include military leaders that have relied on an international criminal network to prop them up and keep the money flowing. And so cutting off Maduro's regime to access illicit trade networks and making sure that we give OFAC the tools to be able to do that is really critical.
Thank you, Congressman. And do you see the additional legislation to help mitigate the threat of actors such as Iran moving forward as well?
I think we need to take, an all of the above strategy approach. None of us want to leave any of the malignant actors who are influencing the propping up of Maduro out. And so continuing, whether it's with a Trump administration or a Biden administration, to make sure that we can use all the tools we have available to us to crack down on that malignant influence is essential.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. I had an earlier conversation with Congressman Waltz, and so I'd like to play that conversation, then turn back to you, Congresswoman, for final thoughts after you hear from Congressman Waltz. Before doing so, for the audience, Congressman Michael Waltz has served since 2018, representing Florida's 6th congressional district, Eastern Florida coast, including southern Jacksonville suburbs and the city of Daytona Beach. He's an Army veteran, National Guardsman, and also serves on the Venezuela Democracy Caucus. So let's roll that tape, please. Congressman Waltz, thanks for joining us today. As a member of the Venezuela Democracy Caucus, and with your experience in counterterrorism and expertise on Middle East foreign policy, you've been a prominent voice in Congress on the push for democracy in both Venezuela and in Iran. As the two sanctioned regimes increasingly work together with oil for gold schemes and Hezbollah networks propping up the Maduro regime, what can and should Congress be doing to counter the threat that Iran poses to the return of democracy in Venezuela?
Well, thank you, Jason, for having us on and having this important panel. It's great to be on with Congresswoman, my colleague from Florida, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I just want to say very quickly, there's a lot of things that Debbie and I disagree on, but improving the lives of the people of Venezuela and coming together in the Democracy Caucus is absolutely common ground and something that I'm proud to work with her on. And I also just want to state very strongly and stringently how sad it is, truly heartbreaking and tragic, what the Maduro regime has done to its people with the assistance of the IRGC, with the assistance of Iran, but using its socialist enterprise and its food, medicine, and other networks essentially as extortion mechanisms, as extortion rackets for support is truly sad and disheartening. Seeing its infrastructure, its ports, its roads essentially turn into arteries for various types of narco groups, and seeing its natural resources doing very little for its people, but enriching the elites. And we just need to continue to call that out for what it is. So to answer the question, what more can Congress do and should be doing? One thing that I am focused on is the air bridge between Tehran and Caracas with Mahan Airways, and continuing to work to shut that down. I think the administration has done a good job in pulling back our European partners in pulling back those air routes, but also looking at the fees that they were paying for overflight for all kinds of nefarious things. But the bottom line is whether it is evading sanctions with, again, even more of Venezuela's natural resources like gold, possibly even with uranium, whether it is sending in technical assistance, military and otherwise from the IRGC, there is little good that is coming out of, from all of the information that I've seen, there is little good that's coming out of the Mahan Airways. And I do have to state that the planes that they're using, the long-range Airbuses that are capable of making that flight, 8 of them were purchased in 2015 while the Obama administration was looking to complete the Iran deal. And I wholeheartedly disagree that we did not take stronger action to prevent that from happening. I am glad now to see, again, some of those air routes shut down through aggressive action. One of the things, bottom line, that I want to look at is the overflight fees that Tehran has to pay. Those fees are paid through the international banking system, through wire transfers, and enforcing the existing sanctions, but also tightening up legislatively where we need to, because if you look at the map, if those Airbuses from Mahan Airways are not able to overfly various countries and have to work around, they just don't have the legs, they just don't have the range to get to Caracas, and we can shut down that air bridge. So that is something that I'll be focused on in this next Congress, and continuing to hold both Tehran and Caracas accountable.
Thank you, Congressman. Second question. Last year, you introduced with Senators Rubio and Scott the Venezuelan Contracting Restriction Act to hold Maduro accountable by prohibiting U.S. federal agencies from doing business with anyone that supports his regime. Considering that a modified version of that policy that applies to the Department of Defense was signed into law in the National Defense Authorization Act, how is this critical to improving the situation in Venezuela?
Well, thank you for mentioning the legislation we were able to get passed in the NDAA, in the National Defense Authorization Act, working with Senators Rubio, and Scott to get that done. That essentially, as you mentioned, puts companies on notice that if you're doing business with the Maduro regime, with its abuses, with its extrajudicial killings, with its human rights violations, and with the oppression of the Venezuelan people, you will not be able to do business with the U.S. government, and should not be able to do business with the U.S. government. In last year's defense bill, in order to get it passed, we had to get that down to just the Defense Department, but that is a $700+ billion budget that will no longer be able to be accessed, and this is going forward by companies that are doing business with the Maduro regime. And this next year, what I'm looking to do is expand that to various other agencies, so that eventually we apply those restrictions to the entire U.S. government. Hopefully, the Maduro regime will be gone before we're able to get all of that in place, and that whether it is Guaido or another freely elected representative, that we get a representative government for the Venezuelan people. But at the end of the day, what we cannot have and should not have are American companies profiting off of it and continuing to provide that hard capital and assistance.
Well, Congresswoman Wasserman-Schultz, I want to give you a moment to provide commentary, reflect on Congressman Waltz's comments. He brought up a number of different issues.
Thank you. I certainly agree that it is not always possible for us to work together on every issue, but I have enjoyed working with Congressman Waltz on issues surrounding Venezuela and the Western Hemisphere, and I appreciate that opportunity. Wish we could do that more often with across the aisle, certainly would get a lot more done. I think it's important to point out that the president, unfortunately, really hasn't put himself in the strongest position to lead multilateral efforts around the world. So, respectfully, in response to what the congressman said about the Iran deal, um, given how strongly the European Union countries, of which we were allies in the JCPOA, they certainly didn't appreciate the president rolling that agreement back, and it didn't put Iran in a weaker position. It put them in a stronger position because they were only months from breakout when the JCPOA was in place, and now we know that they are really essentially, unrestricted. So that doesn't help in making sure that Iran isn't able to put more resources into their nefarious engagements. For example, there have been tens of billions of dollars siphoned by from the Venezuelan people by Maduro to try to pay for oil, and we were able to interdict a ship carrying about 1.1 million barrels of fuel from Iran to Venezuela, but just this past Saturday, one got through with 815,000 barrels. So the gasoline for gold exchange between Iran and Venezuela is a real problem. And we can't stop the Maduro regime alone. I can't stress enough the importance of multilateralism. And again, this administration is certainly not put themselves in a strong position to do that. I do also want to point out the importance of bipartisan legislation, of which Congressman Waltz was a supporter, to grant TPS to Venezuelans, because adding the pressure to an already crisis situation in Venezuela by deporting Venezuelans from the United States here in the United States back to Venezuela, not helpful to addressing the crisis or to taking the pressure off Venezuela. And the president could grant TPS right now, and I certainly wish that he would.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman, for that insightful answer, for joining us today, and frankly as well for your leadership in helping to restore democracy in Venezuela. And all these not here, big thank you to Congressman Waltz for joining us today, and for my earlier conversation with him. Congressman, look forward to the next opportunity to host you. Please stay safe and healthy. And I will now turn it over to Diego Area, the Associate Director of the Adrian-Arce Latin America Center, who manages our Venezuela work, and he will moderate the next segment of today's program. Over to you, Diego.
Thank you very much, Jason. And before starting the conversation, I want to remind the audience that you can ask questions to the speakers using the Q&A feature if you are connected through Zoom. And for Twitter, you can ask questions using the hashtag #ACVenezuela. I would like now to introduce the speakers for our next discussion. First, Joseph Umire is the Executive Director for the Center for a Secure Free Society, a national security think tank based in Washington, D.C., and an Atlantic Council author. Umire specializes in analyzing trans-regional threat networks in the Western Hemisphere and provides regular subject matter expert briefings to the U.S. Department of State and other government agencies. He has testified a half-dozen times before the U.S. Congress on a variety of national security topics, including Iran and Hezbollah's presence in Latin America, and he is the co-author of the book, Iran's Strategic Penetration of Latin America. Joseph is also the author of our center's latest report being launched today, titled Maduro Hezbollah Nexus, How Iran-backed Networks Prop Up the Venezuela Regime. With us is also Kirsten Fonterrose, who is director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council, where she leads the security pillar within the Middle East programs. This effort focuses on the Middle East and North Africa's ongoing security challenges, geopolitical competition, and the transatlantic community's role in promoting security and stability to allow for political and economic development. Fonterrose has 20 years of experience working with the national security apparatuses of nations in the Middle East and Africa, from positions within the U.S. Department of Defense, Department of State, the White House, private industry, and nonprofit sector. I'd like to start with the author of the report we're launching today. Joseph, it is a pleasure to finally have this public conversation today with you. And my first question for you will be, in the report, you provide a detailed analysis of how Hezbollah crime terror networks operate in Venezuela and how they engage in illicit activities that prop up the Maduro regime. Can you take us through how this network established in Venezuela and how they are providing a gateway for Iran to grow its footprint in Venezuela?
Yes, first, I'd be remiss if I didn't begin by thanking the Atlantic Council, Adrian Hirsch, Latin America Center, particularly to you, Diego, Domingo, Jason, the whole entire Latin America team. It's been a pleasure to work with you guys over the last few months on this specific report. So very, very honored to be here with you and with others that are distinguished speakers as well. So I think the first thing that we have to do is we have to understand, how Hezbollah operates, right? And I think the first point is that Hezbollah has a multifaceted, multi-dimensional model, right? They have legitimate activities such as a political party in Lebanon, a media group. They have even social services in southern Lebanon, but they blend these legitimate activities with an illicit enterprise. And that illicit enterprise includes criminal activities such as drug trafficking and money laundering, but it also includes terrorist activities, what it's most known for, being designated as a terrorist organization by more than 60 countries worldwide. And so what Hezbollah has done is they've understood a very important lesson, and it's not a lesson that's unlike other mafias in the 20th century, like the Italian mafia or the Irish mob, which is the diasporas matter. The communities abroad matter, particularly in Lebanon, where upwards of 14% of Lebanon's GDP comes from remittances. So they knew that there was an importance to have a presence abroad from day one, from when they were born in the 1980s. And so what Hezbollah has done is they established a unit. It's called Unit 910. It also goes by the name of External Security Organization, or it also goes by the name of the Islamic Jihad Organization. It's basically Hezbollah's clandestine extraterritorial arm to be able to carry out these operations. They function like an intelligence organization. They develop assets, they use tradecraft, they use agents, and they build the capabilities in the Lebanese communities around the world. So taking this to Latin America, some of the largest communities in the region are in Colombia and Venezuela. Now, these communities have been there for a very long time. They migrated initially about 150 years ago, and there's been waves of migration since. Many of them were refugees leaving the violence during the Ottoman era in the Middle East in the later part of the 19th and early 20th century. Also, obviously, the Lebanese Civil War. So this refugee network that initially was used to basically help people to come out of war-torn areas and come into what once was a very vibrant economy in Venezuela has been exploited by Hezbollah, particularly by this Unit 910, to be able to infiltrate it. And let me be clear about this point. The majority of the Lebanese communities in Latin America are not involved in these illicit activities. Nonetheless, they are as much a victim as they are a target of Unit 910 from Hezbollah to be able to infiltrate them and then to create these support networks abroad. And so in Venezuela, in the report, what we do is we outline how this works in terms of specific Hezbollah support cells and Lebanese families, or what we call clans that are operating inside Venezuelan territory to the benefit of Hezbollah, but also to the benefit of the Maduro regime. For Hezbollah, they provide a safe space. Basically, once you're in Venezuela, you don't have to worry about international authorities. Whether you have a red notice, international arrest warrant, you're indicted, whatever, you get to Venezuela, you're going to be secure. And Maduro provides that protection to them. On the flip side, these networks allow the Maduro regime to have tentacles in far-reaching places, including in the Middle East, but also in Europe, also in Asia, where Hezbollah obviously truly is a trans-regional network. And I say, I think the refrain that kind of comes to mind often when I think about this, it's an old military refrain, and it goes with the saying of, experts talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics. And I think essentially what we're talking about when we come to Latin America is a logistical network. And it's important to identify it as such, because when we talk about Hezbollah, there's a hierarchy to the leadership structure in Lebanon. When we get to Latin America, it gets gray. We don't know if they're Hezbollah members, supporters, sympathizers. But what we know is that they're operating within certain cover platforms to be able to essentially create logistical operatives. These are logistical operatives that are operating in Venezuela that you can't say are formally part of Hezbollah, but they're definitely working to the benefit of Hezbollah and the Maduro regime. So I think the logistics matters. And I think the report, the big point of the report, I think the big impetus of it is it maps these logistical networks and takes a nuanced approach to something that's been very speculative, I think, over the years, because we've heard about Hezbollah in Venezuela, but we haven't really studied it at a granular level. So that's really what the intent was with the report, which again, I thank the Atlanta Council for publishing it and for the entire team for working with me on it.
Thank you, Joseph, and we'll be talking about the clans soon. But first, I want to welcome Kirsten and thank you for participating today. And this is my question for you. We have seen geopolitical actors such as Russia and China intervening in Venezuela and helping to sustain the Maduro regime. And earlier this year, Iran has been increasing its overt support for Maduro, engaging in gas for gold schemes and helping without much success to rebuild oil refineries in Venezuela. From your perspective, what are Iran's national and geopolitical interests in Venezuela, especially at a time when it is facing significant economic and social challenges of its own?
Thanks, Diego. Great to be here. And many thanks for this report, which I'm excited is no longer embargoed, so I can share it with the Middle East and Hezbollah watching community in my own network. In terms of Iran's strategy for Venezuela, they're really implementing the same model they're using in Syria. It's to prop up a corrupt regime in exchange for three things, one of which is strategic, one is operational, and one is tactical. The strategic interest is in countering US global leverage. In the spirit of my enemy, my enemy's enemy is my friend, Iran is searching globally for pockets of influence outside the US orbit in order to reduce its own isolation. Because of naming the US as one of its two top adversaries, along with Israel, Iran has self-limited options for economic or strategic partnerships around the world. And Iran enjoys civil relationships and humming trade in benign sectors with several neighbors in the Persian Gulf whom they do not perceive as a threat. But otherwise, in other parts of the world, they seek out regimes that are not aligned with the US, not dependent on the US for assistance, and or do not have significant trade with the US. And Iran's goal here is to identify partner nations that will assist it with circumventing sanctions and international law. And the operational interest I mentioned is exactly that, circumventing sanctions. Iran is desperate for customers for its oil sector. They're being bled by China, which is buying oil for pennies on the dollar. Like they're trading in futures and that are a sure thing, and they're storing it in ships offshore. So Iran needs other buyers, but they can't take payment in dollars because they can't participate in the world's legitimate financial markets. So Venezuela's gold is the perfect alternative. And then in terms of the tactical interest they have in Venezuela, it's in securing a permissive and a permissive environment for criminal activity, much as Joseph just mentioned. The Lebanese Hezbollah raises money through multiple criminal networks that originate or transit in Venezuela and elsewhere in Latin America, some of which, but certainly not all, find its way back to Hezbollah coffers in South Lebanon. So there's that strategic, that operational, and that tactical plank of this strategy that they've seen successful in Syria and are now looking to implement in Europe.
Thank you, Kirsten. Joseph, I would like to talk right away about the clans and your vision about that. In the report, you show how 3 Hezbollah clans operate in Venezuela's illicit economy, including drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and money laundering, and how key members of these clans have held positions at the highest levels of government in Venezuela. What are some of the most prominent examples of how these clans are supporting the Maduro regime, and why this is a threat to democracy and stability in Venezuela, and how is the future look like around this?
Yes, well, okay, so I'll get into the clans, but I think there's 2 important constructs that we have to understand, theoretical constructs, to be able to understand how these clans operate. The first is something that a colleague of mine, also another Atlanta Council author, Douglas Farah, has called criminalized states, because it's a very paradigm shift from what we think about in Western Westphalian democratic nations about terrorism and organized crime. When we think about it, for instance, we think about it as a bad activity that needs to be neutralized by our state institutions. For instance, our immigration services are designed and are provided the mission to stop criminals and terrorists from coming into the country the best that they can. But when we get into these other regimes, such as the Maduro regime in Venezuela or the Ayatollahs in Iran, that changes. They don't view terrorism and organized crime the same way that we do. And by extension, they use terrorism and organized crime as an extension of its foreign policy and an extension of its state apparatus. And I think that's a very important distinction to make to understand how this operates. The second point is something that the National Defense University has worked very extensively on, and is a concept called convergence. And what convergence essentially means is the logistical connections between organized crime and terrorism, something that for a long time was debated because obviously terrorist groups aren't going to abandon their cause and just get into criminal activities, and criminal organizations aren't just taking up terrorist causes. But what you are seeing is kind of what I said in the last question, was you're seeing these logistical networks of financiers and fixers and facilitators emerge to be able to connect these two phenomenons into one big problem set. And so with that, using those two constructs, both the convergence and also the idea of criminalized states, applying that into Venezuela is when we can get into who these clans are. So when we talk about Hezbollah in Latin America, probably most people will associate that with one of the worst, if not the worst, international terrorist incident in South America, which is the Ami attack in 1994, where the Hezbollah and Iran have been accused of essentially blowing up a building of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, killing 85 people and injuring hundreds more. One of the lesser known facts of that attack is that one of the suspected individuals that helped prepare not just that attack, but also the bombing of the Israeli embassy 2 years earlier, is a Venezuelan Lebanese individual named Amir Mohammed Akil Rada. So Amir Mohammed Akil Rada worked within this construct of what we talked about earlier, this Unit 910, this extraterritorial clandestine arm that Hezbollah has around the world. And it did it in conjunction with individuals that were working directly with Hezbollah in Lebanon and with the IRGC in Iran. And so that individual, after the Ami attack, he's been in Venezuela ever since. And that's, I think, one of the points of how Maduro provides this safe space. We've never been able to detect him or his movements. I'm sure law enforcement, and not just in the United States, but in other countries, in Argentina, have been looking for him. But it's been very difficult to get him, or to at least question him, because he has state support from the Maduro regime. Moving forward, there's been other members that we identify another clan, one that's probably more well-known publicly, which we call the Nasruddin clan, because one of its members, one of its leading members, Ghazi Nasruddin, wasn't just a supporter of the Maduro regime, he was part of the regime. He was in its foreign ministry. We must remember that Nicolas Maduro was foreign minister before he was president. And so he worked very closely with Nicolas Maduro at developing this clandestine structure that Hezbollah has used to be able to move from the Middle East to Venezuela. There's an indictment that's in the Department of Justice that was just unsealed in May of this year that talks about a potential weapons for cocaine scheme where Ghazi Nasruddin, one of the leading members of this clan, was involved in facilitating or fixing a relationship between Hezbollah and the Maduro regime, so that the Maduro regime could be used as a broker between cocaine that would be going from the FARC to Hezbollah, and weapons that would be coming back from Hezbollah to Colombia's FARC. Now, these are allegations, these are accusations in an indictment, but this fits within a pattern of trend of how we've seen Hezbollah operate, as well as the Maduro regime operate. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about Iran, because I think lately, at least in the press, there's been a lot of discussion about Iran's presence in Venezuela, which has been very visible in 2020 with the tankers and the supermarkets and other things. And I think what is important to understand is the way Iran operates in Venezuela, is exactly as Kirsten said, is not that different than how they operate in Syria. They use Hezbollah as a proxy, as a network that allows them to have presence. In this case, in the case of Syria, it's in the Arab country, in Syria, but in the case of Venezuela, it's in a Latin American country. And they use these individuals that have connections in both places, what we call super facilitators, because they can move networks from across countries and multiple continents. One of the most well-known is Alex Saab. Alex Saab was named as the kind of special representative for the Maduro regime to Iran. He's detained in Cape Verde, and a process that's taking longer than what most people anticipated. And one of the things we talk about in the report is how the Maduro regime is already tapping into that same network, that clan structures, the support cells, to be able to find other individuals that can potentially either replace Saab or at least do the work that Saab was doing with Iran in the Middle East in the time being. There's a particular set of brothers, the Khalil Massoud brothers, that have been involved in some of these trips and some of these discussions with Iran, with Turkey, with the Maduro regime. And they have a very broad network that extends beyond Venezuela, even to places as far afield like Bolivia, where they've been able to have business sweeteners with the Evo Morales government back then. So these are transnational and trans-regional networks, and they move very quickly to the benefit of both.
Thank you, Joseph. This is a really concerning issue, not only for Latin America or the U.S., but for the whole international community. Thank you for your comments. And before moving the conversation to the impact of the U.S. elections in this relation with Kirsten, I want to remind the audience that you can ask questions to speakers by using the Q&A feature if you are connected through Zoom. And for Twitter, you can ask your questions using the hashtag AC Venezuela. Kirsten, the presidential elections in the United States will for sure have an impact in U.S. foreign policy towards Iran and Venezuela. Regarding Iran, how do you think this policy playing out in a second-term Trump presidency versus a Biden administration? How could changes in U.S. policy towards Iran change Iran's geopolitical calculus? And what could that mean for its relationship with the Maduro regime in Venezuela?
Diego, a second Trump administration will seek to reduce Iran's options for circumventing sanctions to make sure that the maximum pressure campaign has more impact. And this could mean more robust efforts to halt the oil for gold deals that we're seeing going through. And by more robust, I mean, not simply messaging, but there could be some activity to halt additional tankers. A second-term Trump administration would also continue maximum pressure in terms of looking for a further data about IRGC business dealings. And the more of that data that is uncovered, additional sanctions will be levied on the companies to which they are linked. And that will definitely come back to hit the companies exactly that Joseph was just talking about, the ones with legs in both places. The financial pressure will continue to force the Iranian regime into desperate relationships, like the potential 25-year security deal they're looking at with China for the process of sovereignty, frankly, and closer ties with regimes like Maduro's. But in terms of Iran's calculus, these desperate relationships risk hurting their relations with the EU and the E3, who are opposed to the human political rights violations of both. And so Iran can't risk losing Europe. Their strongest piece of armor right now is the lack of a unified position on Iran between the US and Europe. And frankly, speaking to anyone from the Maduro regime who might be watching this, if you want a Trump administration to lose interest in unseating you, you should sever your relationship with Iran. A Biden administration will offer sanctions relief to Iran in exchange for re-entering negotiations on their nuclear program. And this relief could reduce their need for a buyer of the oil in Venezuela. They may choose to place some distance between themselves and Maduro in order to improve their standing with Europe. And it's like a small confidence building measure with the US if those negotiations are taking place. Iran will have to weigh how far it can go in embracing the Maduro regime, no matter who's in power. And it will absolutely be altered based on the US election. Because it's not a long-standing bond of friendship or obligation. It's, a decade or two old, but that's nothing in Iran. And right now, the relationship is effectively transactional. And as Joseph mentioned, it's mostly based on logistics. There was an Iranian general recently, just a few days ago. He's an advisor to the supreme leader, and I want to quote him. He said, "Venezuelans are communists, but they stood up to the Americans and we are helping them, giving them software and giving them ideas such as how to mobilize people and how to repel cyber attacks." So that really tells us that they see this relationship as strategic in terms of their opposition to the US. Venezuela is another route through which they can poke the US in the eye, and that it is fairly transactional. There's not an ideological link there. So they will adjust how closely they take that regime to heart, into their breast, based on where they think the US administration is sitting vis-a-vis Iran itself.
Thank you, Kirsten. That's why it's so key and critical to keep raising awareness about this, not only in the region, but around the world. Thank you. Joseph, I want us to focus now into the future and next steps. In the report, you provide specific recommendations for the United States and the international community to counter the dual threat of trans-regional organized crime and international terrorism that the Hezbollah poses. How can our Latin American partners and Europe, in coordination with the US, do to coordinate actions to diminish the influence of Hezbollah's illicit networks, especially considering the migration crisis and political crisis underway in Venezuela?
Well, thanks, Diego, for the question. Yes, the report has 5 specific policy recommendations. Let me see if I could touch on 2 of them, at least a couple of them for right now. I think one of the things is within this idea of having a coalition, a broader coalition of countries, in order to have that broader coalition, we have to speak the same language. And this is somewhat of a legal challenge, but it's also a challenge of perspective. And what I'm talking about specifically is how do we view Hezbollah? There's a way that we view Hezbollah here in the United States that is different than even some countries in Europe. Now, but we've had this debate in Europe over the last decade that's led to more extensive designations of Hezbollah, the whole organization, as a terrorist group, for instance, in Germany or in the UK. The European Union being only designating what they call the military wing of Hezbollah. Now we take that conversation over to South America, to Latin America. Well, this is a conversation that was way overdue. And I think it's very much needed to happen. And let me explain why these designations are so important, because if we don't have the common understanding of what is Hezbollah, we often create miscommunication among our agencies. Let me give a small example. Here in the United States, for a long time, there was a lot of confusion as to Hezbollah's operational abilities in South America. And what would happen is oftentimes you would have, say, the State Department, who would call their counterparts in any country in South America, say Peru, for instance, and would ask, do you have any international Islamist terrorist cells operating in your country? And the Peru would say, no, we don't. And they would say, okay, well, chalk that off. But then they would probably think about it for a second, maybe say, Joseph came to my office the other day and he was bugging me about these Hezbollah networks in Peru. And then they would call back and they would ask another question and say, let me be a little more specific. Does Hezbollah operate in your country? Then Peru would say yes. And was like, well, why did yesterday you said, well, one of the reasons is Hezbollah does not formally or legally classify Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. It could be a political party in Lebanon. It could be just a counterfeiting organization. And so the designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, particularly in Latin America, helps us create that common language that allows for greater cooperation. It also, by the way, criminalizes the act of being a member of a terrorist organization. And this is a little bit different than narco trafficking and money laundering, where it's more reactive in nature, where you have to wait for those illicit activities to take place, and then you basically seek justice. In terrorism, or in counterterrorism specifically, you have to anticipate the action and stop it before it takes place. It's way too late, obviously, to stop a terrorist attack after the bomb's blown up. And so in this case, we have to be much more proactive in doing that, and having Latin American countries designate Hezbollah is one important way to do that. This conversation has already taken off in Latin America. Last year, in July of 2019, Argentina, under the previous government of Mauricio Macri, became the first government in Latin America's history to officially designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. I work closely with many of the individuals in the Macri government that were responsible for this. They deserve a lot of credit. They really got these conversations started. Since then, Paraguay, Colombia, and Honduras have also designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. And there's many countries in Latin America that are considering doing this. The context of these designations were one of the, I think, untold successes of the Trump administration, in the sense that it was coalescing this counterterrorism coalition through conferences, these ministerial hemispheric counterterrorism conferences that were led by the State Department, but done with our partners in Latin America. That's built a coalition of 18 plus countries that have all at least acknowledged that Hezbollah is a problem in Latin America. And this is an important conversation to have. Had it not been for COVID-19, I think we would be having this conversation right now in 2020, and other countries would possibly have designated Hezbollah in Latin America as well. Unfortunately, things have stalled because of the virus, as most of the world. But I think it's very important to restart this conversation and to basically continue this effort, because until we all kind of have this same perspective legally, we'll continue to have these miscommunications and policy vacuums in place.
Thank you, Joseph. And before opening the floor for questions from the audience, Kirsten, I want to ask you, the international community can and should have a more assertive role in curtailing the nefarious actors and illicit activities that are keeping the Maduro regime entrenched. That being said, sanctions have been a foreign policy tactic deployed heavily on both the Maduro regime and in Iran. While sanctions have been an important deterrent, they have their limits, as shown in Venezuela. In just perspective, what additional actions must be considered to tackle Iran's, as well as other malign actors' intervention in Venezuela?
Let's clarify really quickly from the community of Iran watchers what we think about, the threat posed by Iran's intervention in Venezuela really looks like. Much to Joseph's point, Iran's involvement in Venezuela is dangerous from a terrorist finance perspective, but not really from a terrorist recruitment perspective. So in other words, the concern is about Iran using Venezuela to source funding for Hezbollah activities everywhere, Syria, Lebanon, even Yemen, sending trainers and the like. But we have not seen Hezbollah able to recruit violent operators in Venezuela. So this does mean that different authorities are unleashed. And, the once concerning Iranian push in South America to target Lebanese diaspora members into full-fledged members of Hezbollah acting on their direction has failed. And the cultural centers that Iran sponsored, for instance, are usually empty now, or they've been undercut and penetrated by US or allied intelligence, or they've got attendees who come for the free internet, but they're really not interested in the narrative that Iran is putting out. So, we see things like unconfirmed rumors about training camps on Margarita Island, and we see Maduro sending representatives to Lebanon to meet with Hezbollah leaders, according to the US Department of Treasury. And we estimate that about 6,000 passports are issued every year by the Maduro regime to Iranians. But what we have not seen is evidence of a new kinetic threat posed by Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah in Latin America recently. And the bombing in Argentina that we've mentioned previously was in 1986. Or 1994. I'm sorry, it was 26 years ago. So this can impact the designation discussion, because to designate on the basis of a terrorist activity, you need to have proof that the organization was involved in something within the last 2 to 3 years. But financing or abetting the financing of terror is a valid justification for a terrorist designation. And sometimes we need to remind our partners of that, because they're kind of not thinking along those lines, or their own intelligence services have not been able to gather the data that would create the proof for that kind of connection. It's much easier if there's a bombing and you have debris you can exploit, but it's much harder if you're trying to hack into financing networks. So there's also the possibility that remains that if U.S. tensions with Iran escalate to the point of outright war or something, then they could choose to activate a network in Latin America to smuggle people or material into the U.S. to conduct attacks on our homeland. But frankly, in that situation, U.S. intelligence liaison relationships with Latin American partners would likely prove helpful in preventing those networks from operating. So really, we're looking at breaking down the involvement in more than just Lebanese Hezbollah. From the way we see it, this is really IRGC writ large, which is several organizations. The unit that Joseph mentioned, that's mentioned in the report, in addition to Quds Force, they've really expanded their operative network beyond, the IRGC has beyond just Lebanese Hezbollah. And when we talk about things like the Iranian airline Mahan Air that is ferrying gold bars in the same, is the same sanctioned Mahan Air, which spread the coronavirus into Iran and from Iran into Lebanon and into Syrian refugee camps. So in addition to just sort of the typical threats we're talking about, we're also talking about a layer of growing concern about the role the IRGC-Maduro nexus is playing in spreading a global pandemic. So we see that the threat that concerns us from the Iranian intervention in Venezuela is really fourfold. One, financial crime that funds terrorism. 2, sanctions circumvention. 3, endangerment of global health now. And 4, the relationships with elites that Joseph mentioned in terms of the clans that enable all 3 of these things. So some additional tools open to the international community include things like stringent enforcement of their own national laws in companies where the criminal networks have tentacles. So it's not just Interpol and it's not just the US or even Europe trying to talk to these countries and inflict our own domestic laws on them or wait until the problem reaches our border. But it's working with these law enforcement organizations in Latin American countries to improve their own capacity so that they can do the data gathering that would help us press these cases against Hezbollah actors. It's kind of like taking down Jimmy Hoffa for tax evasion, but sometimes the smaller crimes are easier to prove and prosecute, and disrupting the networks Iran has from Venezuela into other countries is an effective way to reduce Hezbollah's resources and capacity with which they prop up regimes and other Iranian proxies. So it could also mean things like boarding planes and ships and shutting down banks and seizing illicit cargo. There's such law enforcement actions that can be done in, either domestically or with international synchronization. A second tool we might look at is strategic litigation. And by this, I mean holding individual members of the regime accountable for their role in terrorist activity or human rights abuses that break international laws. So rather than applying sanctions across the board and potentially extending the painful impact of sanctions to the general public, this looks at litigating the crimes of individuals at the top and squeezing them personally. And our program at the Atlantic Council is researching the legal basis for options for this. And of course, this will be shared with the community at large when it's ready. The problem we have at present in the US is that, and frankly, in the international community, is that there are limited options for responding to Iranian intervention in Venezuela. We have kinetics on one hand, we have sanctions on the other hand. We don't have a whole lot of tools in the middle, but the two options I've mentioned attempt to fill out that space in the middle. And I think, combined with the recommendations that Joseph makes in the paper already, that said, kinetics are never off the table for the US. However, in this case, the decision will be greatly weighted against using kinetics, not only just because of where either presidential candidate stands on this use of force, which is with restraint, but because of Russia's relationship with Maduro and the potential for a conflict here to escalate quickly and broadly if kinetics were the choice.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Joseph. Now I would like to take a question from the audience, and it's from Andrea Quiroga Berrizbeitia. Considering the upcoming elections, why should American voters must be concerned by the relation between the Maduro's regime and Hezbollah and Iran?
Is that, should I answer?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. First, let me just one point on what Kristen said, and it is in the report, which I think is incredibly important, which is the use of financial intelligence. That has been literally probably the spearhead of a lot of these designations that have been done in Latin America. The financial intelligence units, which is kind of like the nerve center of a government's ability to understand what illicit financial activity happens in their country and globally, is important. What we propose is to extend the cooperation that's already been built and been building in Latin America to the Middle East. Important money laundering jurisdictions such as in Bahrain or in the UAE or in Kuwait, and places, especially taking, kind of capitalizing on the moment where the Arab world is waking up to the Iranian threat and the threat of the IRGC and making those connections. But to the question, I think it's, the easiest way to kind of understand this for your basic American viewer is that these are networks that are at play here. These aren't just nation states. These are non-state networks that don't respect boundaries and they don't respect borders. They'll move quicker than a government can move to be able to move assets from one country to another. And so Hezbollah doesn't have limitations in terms of where the Venezuelan-Colombian border stops or the Venezuelan-Brazilian border. They can move in and out of the region and in and out of the country with relative ease. So the Maduro regime, their whole entire asymmetric warfare strategy is built around the idea of using unconventional weapons to be able to destabilize Latin America and delegitimize the United States. This is a problem that's growing that will affect Americans, not only abroad, but Americans here in the homeland, because the networks will get into here if they're not here already. In the case of Hezbollah, there's been several cases that have been prosecuted or being prosecuted. In some cases have already been convicted of Hezbollah operatives operating here in the United States. In New York, the Ali Karani case comes to mind. That was he was a Lebanese individual that was convicted not too long ago, earlier this year. And when you start to map these networks, you see the connections into Latin America. There's two real quick cases that I can mention that of Hezbollah ESO operatives that were operating in Latin America beyond just the terror financial activity, likely doing pre-operational surveillance, but obviously preparing for some kind of action. One was in Panama with a gentleman named Samar al-Dabek that's now he's arrested. He's in the custody of the prosecutors in New York. And the other one is Mohammed Ghalib Hamdar, who was arrested in Peru and was found with surveillance footage and imagery and different kind of chemical substances on his person. So these networks exist, they move, and they're undoubtedly going to be in the United States as well if they're not already here.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you everyone who joined today. Thank you to Representatives Wasserman, Schultz, and Waltz for participating. Thank you also to our distinguished panelists, Kirsten Forte-Rose and Joseph Umire, to the Center's Director, Jason Marczak, and special recognition to Domingo Sadurní for his key role in organizing this event. Lastly, I want to remind you that the report on the Maduro-Hezbollah nexus and how Iran-backed networks prop up the Venezuela regime is live in our webpage, atlanticcouncil.org. Thank you for joining us today, and until next time.